Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. I'm in London, in Maida Vale, and behind me is the house where David Ben Gurion lived quite briefly. So Ben Gurion, who's born David Gurion in Polotsk, Poland, who was then part of the Russian Empire. So his father was a successful lawyer, and Ben Gurion grew up in a town where almost half the population was Jewish, and he said that relations with the Polish and Russian communities in the town were extraordinarily good. So he experienced no anti-Semitism there. He was brought up a relatively liberal Jew, speaking Polish, Yiddish, learning a bit of Russian, and he had a few siblings. Well, he had a twin who died at birth, but and nevertheless, he was very keen to go and create Israel, because he was a child when Zionism, as we know it, was expounded by Theodor Herzl in his book, The Jewish State. So he was a bright boy, he was a polyglot, he went to the University of Warsaw, but he left without graduating. He was keen to get to Palestine as soon as possible. So he was only about 20 years old when he made Aliyah, I hope I pronounced that correctly, as in immigration to Palestine, which is then part of the Ottoman Empire. So it seemed that it would be part of the Ottoman Empire forever. So the World Jewish Congress had met, and the idea of Zionism had got going. There's Poale Zion, various organizations like that. However, Zionism was still fairly controversial amongst Jewish people. Some ultra-Orthodox Jews, as today, said, no, this is preempting the Messiah, we mustn't do that. Or some Jews who were quite assimilated to the countries that they were citizens of said, no, we shan't do this because we're already accused of dual loyalty, so we mustn't seem to provide grist to the mill of the anti-Semites who would believe that the Jews are always some sort of alien element, and they don't bear total allegiance to the countries that they belong to. And anyway, so the Jewish community, when he arrived there, was very small. It was only about 10% of the population. And the Kaiser of Germany had professed himself in favor of this, and of course the Kaiser held a great deal of sway over the Ottoman Empire, and some of the British elite had been won round to the idea. Anyway, he had to make his living as a farm labourer there, as a night watchman, things like that. So he was living in rather straitened circumstances. It was a very hand-to-mouth existence, considering if he'd stayed in Poland, he could have qualified as a lawyer or something and done well for himself. So he decided he wanted to be a lawyer in the Ottoman system, so he had to perfect his Turkish. He moved to Thessaloniki. It's now in Greece, but back then was part of the Ottoman Empire and had a very large Jewish community, mostly wiped out in the Second World War. Anyway, so he became fluent in Turkish, and he hadn't passed his law exams when the First World War broke out. He'd studied for some time in Istanbul. Back then we called it Constantinople. So he was back to what's now Palestine or Israel in the First World War. I won't tell the whole story of his life. He soon got married. He had a few children. He was quite a liberal in his Judaism. But anyway, he later learned English. So that was 5 languages he spoke. But he pretty soon became convinced that the Arabs could not be conciliated. They were inveterate in their hostility to large-scale Jewish immigration. There were some Arabs actually in the early 1920s who said, okay, we can get along well with them. Chaim Weizmann, briefly president of the World Zionist Congress, he met the king of Transjordan, even donned Arab dress in a gesture of amity. But some of the more moderate Arabs who were willing to make an accommodation with major Jewish immigration were assassinated by the hardliners. So soon there was enmity between the two communities. So he was one of the more moderate ones, like involved in the Labour Party. We cooperate with the British where we can, constantly pressurising them, demand to raise the immigration quota through the 1920s, through the 1930s. The British appointed a governor of Palestine, and one of the governors they appointed was actually a Jewish guy, a British Jew, Lord Simon. Anyway. So some of the hardliners in the Zionist community were saying we ought to fight with the British, rebel against them in the 1930s, but there were other problems fighting against Arabs there. The Haganah and Night Squads were fighting there. So Ord Wingate, a British Gentile who completely embraced the Zionist cause, came and helped them out with their Night Squads fighting there. And on into the Second World War. There'd been a white paper on Palestine in 1939, sort of proposal for legislation saying that they would only allow 15,000 Jews into Palestine each year for 5 years, subject to the approval of the Palestinian Arab community, and after that they would see what the next step would be. Of course, the UK was under major pressure from all of the Arab world and all of the Muslim world not to let in excessive Jewish immigration, because they said the Palestinians are worried their homeland is being taken away from them, that they'll become a minority, they'll be driven out. Well, obviously that did happen, but in the 1930s, the desire to move to Israel became much greater, or Palestine as it then was, mandatory Palestine, because of course the National Socialists took office in Germany, so it pretty soon became urgent for the German Jewish community to emigrate. That soon applied to Austria and to part of what's now the Czech Republic as well. And so obviously there was great sympathy for the Jewish community, and some people who got out in time, their lives were saved or got to other places, but obviously there was the Holocaust, 1/3 of the Jewish community of the world annihilated in just 3 years. And so it seemed to lend point to Theodor Herzl's observation that without a land of their own, Jews would never be safe. He wanted a land without a people for a people without a land. Are the Palestinians not people? Well, I know some Zionists will tell you the Palestinians are not really Palestinian, they're Jordanian or Egyptian or something. But then you might say, well, how come the Jews are Israeli then? Not all of them are. Most Jewish people don't live in Israel. There are more Jews who are Americans than there are Israelis, and on and on. Anyway, the Second World War ended, and the UK was keen to expedite independence as quickly as possible. In 1939, the United Kingdom had declared its intention to withdraw from mandatory Palestine within 10 years. It was done within 9. And the United Nations, they partitioned Palestine, granting 2/3 of it to the Jews, who were 1/3 of the population, and 1/3 to the Palestinians, so 2/3 of the population. The Palestinians rejected the plan, saying it was desperately unfair, but the Jews accepted it. They became Israel. So he drafted the Israeli Declaration of Independence and insisted on being the first to put his name to it. And he also said, we've got to bring back Hebrew as a spoken language. What will be our common tongue? Hebrew is the obvious one. It rather not just been a textual language for centuries, read in the synagogue, not used for conversation. Because otherwise, which one do we use? Yiddish? Well, not all Jewish people speak Yiddish, and that favors the Ashkenazim. But Sephardic Jews, they don't speak it, or Jews from other zones of the world. Anyway, and there's only really Central and Eastern European Jews that speak that, say French Jews by this stage. Very few of them would speak Yiddish. Anyway, so independence came, and some Arab states immediately declared war on Israel. He was the founding Prime Minister of Israel. It was really in the hot seat. I won't tell the whole story of all these Arab-Israeli wars, but anyway, they won. He was Prime Minister till, I think it was 1954, briefly lost office and came back again, getting a bit of hay fever. He also served as Defense Minister twice, so he finally retired in 1967. I think he went to live in a kibbutz, and he died in 1963, and that's where he's buried. His wife survived him. So a seminal figure. He was close to Ariel Sharon, whom he had a very high opinion of. Likud didn't like him. He hadn't made enough as a religious state. He managed to unite the two Labour factions, Mapai and Mapan. And he believed that you really need to be decisive and not to vacillate in these tough situations. And this was a time when firm decisions needed to be taken under great pressure. All right, that's enough about David Ben Gurion. Excuse me. Goodbye.